When I was growing up in a very small town in the 80s and 90s, my parents often let me and my little sister home alone for a few hours to go and run some errands. My mom had 2 brothers, and we lived in the same town as one of her brothers and his family. Being a close-knit family, my cousins and I were always over at each other's houses. The adults would leave us alone quite a lot. Back then, it was standard to just tell kids, don't open the doors for anybody and don't use the stove, and we never really thought too much about it. After my parents divorced, it happened more often, as both my parents worked different shifts at their jobs. My sister and I lived in town, and my cousins and my grandma lived outside of town, with only a few neighbors nearby. My sister and I got the best of both worlds, as city kids and country kids. Because we lived in such a small community, everyone knew everyone else, and I think we all felt perfectly safe that nothing bad would ever happen. If it did, of course our neighbors would come to help us. Well, around the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I began to get these strange phone calls. It would be a man's voice on the phone, and these calls would almost always come when I was home alone. This person would tell me they could see me, that they knew I was alone, that they were coming to get me. When I'd get these calls, I'd usually just hang up without saying anything. Of course, it terrified me, but I was too scared to tell my parents. I was scared by the calls, but I also liked getting to stay home alone. Being left to take care of my sister made me feel like I was a grown-up, and I didn't want my parents to stop leaving me in charge. Stupidly, I kept the calls all to myself. One day, while my dad was at work, my cousin, who was a year older than me, was at my house. We were watching TV and playing together when the phone rang. She answered it, and her face went pale. She hung up right away and started crying. I immediately asked her what was wrong, but she just shook her head and said, "I can't tell you." I pressed, and she finally told me about how this man would call her a lot when she was home alone, always telling her he knew she was by herself, and he was coming to get her. I was completely shocked. I explained that I had been getting the exact same calls. We immediately agreed that it had to be one of her older brothers, or maybe one of their friends playing a mean joke on us. We calmed down and laughed it off. I didn't get another call for a while after that, so I almost forgot about it. In the summer between my 7th and 6th grade years, my grandma had taken a part-time job, and my mom lived in another town. This meant my sister and I were home alone almost all day, every day while my dad worked. We spent our days outside playing in the yard, riding our bikes around the neighborhood, and tanning in our backyard a lot. One day my sister was gone to a friend's, and my cousin was back at my house. We were listening to some music and dancing around in the living room when the phone rang. I picked it up, and there it was, that same voice. At this point, I was 12 years old, and I had developed a bit of an attitude. When the man told me he knew we were home alone, I laughed and said, "Liar." He waited for a moment and said, "I can prove that I know you're alone." I laughed again, a little more nervously this time, and said, "Oh yeah? Then do it." His response came as a shock. "I love that little yellow tank top you're wearing today." By this time, my cousin had turned off the music and was watching me, so she saw when the color drained out of my face. I was freaking out. I had just gotten a new outfit and was wearing it, a yellow tank top and jean shorts with matching yellow and pink patches. I yelled into the phone, "Leave us alone." I slammed it down, my heart racing. I started crying and told my cousin. It was him. He knows we're here by ourselves. I ran over to shut the living room curtains, and my cousin told me they thought I should call somebody. I agreed, but instead of calling the police, she picked up the phone and tried to call her mom at work. We got no answer. I called my dad's work and left a message with the gate guard to have him call me. As we were debating what to do next, I heard the gravel in our driveway crunch under the wheels of a vehicle. I ran to the window and peeked outside to see a small red car sitting in the driveway. I did not recognize the car, neither did I recognize the man and the woman inside of it. In our tiny little town, even if I didn't know someone's name, I'd surely know their face. but I did not know either one of them. I froze with fear as I watched them talking to each other. My cousin ran to lock the back door. We had no weapons, and no real way to try to defend ourselves other than my softball bat, which was outside on the carport. As my cousin came back into the room, she hissed, "We have to hide." My cousin hid in a small space between a tall bookshelf and the wall. I threw myself behind a recliner, which faced the window. I watched in horror as the woman walked up to the front door. Instead of knocking, she tried to open the knob. I tried to quiet my breathing, convinced she might be able to hear me, and watched her shadow through the curtains as she walked around to our carport. Sure enough, I heard the doorknob jiggle. There was a pause, and then the door shook as if someone was trying to force it open. I covered my mouth and forced myself not to scream. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds stopped and everything went quiet. I was too afraid to move, so I just waited. I have no idea how much time passed, but eventually we heard the car backing out of the driveway. Once I got the courage, I ran to peek out the window again to make sure they had really left. I saw no trace of the red car, but I was still racked with fear. I told my cousin she should come out, and we hugged each other in relief. Even though we were scared to go outside, we decided to get our bikes and ride to the office my aunt worked at. Once we got there, we told her everything. The phone calls and how long they'd been happening, the red car, and the description of both people inside. She immediately called the police, and we had to give our statements about it all. When my dad got home from work, he of course asked me why I'd called the gate guard, and my aunt filled him in on everything. From that moment, we weren't allowed to stay by ourselves again, until I was probably 16 years old. We never heard anything else on the case, and I also never got any more phone calls again. It's been years, but I still think about that situation often. We never found out who made those calls, or who those people in the red car were. The phone calls could have just been some mean prank, and those people could have just been coincidentally trying to rob the house or something. But the coincidence that day was still crazy. I have no idea if the man kept watching us as we grew up, but the whole thing definitely made me paranoid about a lot of things, and I always make sure to keep a weapon near me at all times when home alone. Now, as a single mom, I'm forced to leave my kids alone occasionally, and I'm very overly protective with them, giving tons of instructions and rules about what they can and can't do. Sure, they may roll their eyes at me, but I know the dangers of the world, and I'd rather be safe than sorry. So this is going to be hard for two reasons. One, I have never talked about this with anyone before, and two, this thing that happened was the worst event of my entire life, so it's a bit complicated. All this was very quick, and I still have no idea why it happened. Anyway, my name is Matthew. I'm 16 years old and I live in Italy. My house is in a little village in the mountains, near the Mont Blanc, the biggest mountain in Europe. Needless to say, there isn't much activity around here during the day. A very small amount of cars pass by, and there's usually no people around either. It's a very calm and cool place at the end of the day. This event took place last April. I'd just gotten out of school after a 2-hour-long Latin test, and was basically already sleeping at that point. I unlocked my bike, waved at my friends, and left, taking the main road that led to the village I live in. As always, there were no cars, no people, no nothing. I was tired, and while riding, I was thinking about the usual things a 15-year-old thinks about when coming home from school. You know, the sort of, should I do homework first or play some video games type of stuff. Well, I was probably overthinking and kept going along the road without realizing I hadn't taken the right turn. I only noticed my mistake a few minutes later and thought, never mind, I'll just take the long way home. At the end of the road, you could take a path that led to the village anyway. I didn't know this yet, but that was probably the worst mistake I've made in my entire life. I kept going, and at that point the road was going through this little forest. All the trees above me were stopping the already small amount of sunlight that there was, so it was basically almost like nighttime. I turned on the bike's flashlight and moved on the right side of the road. Everything was perfectly quiet until I heard a car coming towards me. I was a bit surprised because, as I've already said, there was basically no car activity in the area, especially at this time of day. I didn't panic. After all, it was just a car passing by. After a while, I saw the headlights approaching from the road. The car was still pretty far away and going at a slow pace, like the driver was looking for something. The car sped up and, to my surprise, turned to get right in front of me. Confused and not wanting to get hit by the vehicle, I turned left to bring the bike on the other side of the road. The car did the same and sped up even more. I had very little time to realize what was happening because the car was coming at full speed towards me and I was about to get hit. I did the first thing that came in my mind and jumped off the bike on the right side of the road. I did that just in time because the car ran over my empty bike just a few seconds after I jumped. I sat on the asphalt, my knees and elbows burning from the fall, trying to realize what had just happened, when I saw the driver of the car getting out of the vehicle. He left it by the side of the road and began running towards me without saying a single word. I got up as fast as I could, but the man managed to grab my left arm. I screamed, turned around, and landed the strongest punch I could possibly take on the man's nose. The guy didn't flinch though. He let go of my arm, touched his now bleeding nose, and smiled at me before running back into the car, starting the engine, and taking off. I was in complete shock. I grabbed what was left of my bike and ran home as fast as I could. I was so scared that I left my backpack there in the middle of the road and went to get it the next day. And that's it. I never knew who this guy was or why he just tried to run me over with his car randomly. This is my biggest and only trauma I've experienced in all my life. I can certainly tell you, though, that I will never take that road again. "4 years ago, after just getting my degree, I decided it was time to leave my hometown and pursue my career, so I moved to a big city that was 9 hours away from my parents, and most of my family as well. I had no friends there for months, and my starting salary was low because I came into the company as a trainee. Needless to say, I was very demotivated and missed my family a lot. At some point, I decided to go visit the relatives who lived by the coast, which was about 4 to 5 hours away in car. I didn't have a car myself, and buses were quite expensive. My cousin, though, told me about this Facebook group for rides between my city and another that was close to their town. I went there and found myself a ride with some university students who were just a few years younger than me. The day for the trip came by. I met them. In total, it was 5 of us in a wide sedan. A lady who was studying medicine, the owner of the car, her boyfriend, the driver, a sophomore who was friends with them, and a random guy who found their ad on Facebook. Let's call him Mark. It was a Friday, and people from this whole region were infamous for drinking extremely often, so inspired by the warning my cousin gave me, I awkwardly asked them, sorry to ask, but none of you have been drunk recently or plan to do so on our trip, right? The driver assured me that he was fully sober, and that he wouldn't have taken any passengers on if he wasn't. After hearing that, his girlfriend and the other girl assured that they wouldn't drink either, because their parents were very strict and wouldn't let them misbehave. Mark giggled when hearing that and whispered into my ear, "Women in their town are infamous for drinking a lot and denying it." The trip went on, and we went around dozens of mountains. We had a few conversations about university, work. Most of the trip, though, was us listening to a popular singer from the 90s. And after around 2.5 hours, the driver stopped the car at a gas station as he needed the WC. Mark decided to go with him as he wanted to get something from the store. A few minutes later, I see Mark and our driver come back to the car, each holding a 6-pack of Cerveza. Well, actually, the driver was carrying 2 of those. I almost freaked out but kept my composure, asking them if they were going to drink now. The driver said to me, "I won't until I'm done driving, but let the others and yourself take 1 or 2 if they want to." After 2 hours, we had left the mountains and arrived to a flat land. The sign said we were just 1 kilometer away from the city. Suddenly, the car took a right turn, leaving the main road and heading toward the suburbs. The place looked desolated, and most of the houses looked empty as well. I thought this was a bit weird, but didn't ask anything, because I assumed that maybe we were dropping off the other girl. They probably already knew where she lived after all. The dude then just parked the car on the yard of an abandoned house and said, "We're basically home. Are you guys down for some drinks?" Mark was totally down for it, but the girls kept saying stuff like, "I'm not sure, I usually don't drink." Okay, I'll make an exception this time. Only because we had tough midterms." I refused. How are we going to get to the city then? You guys agreed to take me to the bus station, remember? They said it was already very close and that in the worst case I could just walk there myself. I was a bit more worried though because I planned to take the local bus at a certain hour to get to my cousin's town, which was still 1 hour away from there. They started drinking real fast. The girls got to the point where they were trying to pee doing a handstand against a wall even. I was desperate to leave, but I didn't feel safe walking to the city because it was really dark out there, and this region had a bad reputation for crime. Outsiders specifically were at more risk. There was no phone signal there, so I had to wait for these guys and see what they could offer me. They finally decided it was time to go home. I said it wasn't okay for any of them to drive anymore because they were all super drunk. I offered to drive instead. The driver told me, "It's not up to me, the car belongs to my girlfriend." His girlfriend, of course, refused, saying she didn't even know me and her dad would not be okay with a stranger driving her car. I told him I understood that, but we still had to sort this out somehow. After a bit, the driver finally got off the driver's seat. I assumed they would let me drive now. I was sitting in the middle of the back seat, so I asked the guy next to me to let me out of the car. The sophomore girl who was to my left did, but before I could stop her, she climbed into the driver's seat herself. The girl started saying, "Please let me drive. It's close and there's no one outside anymore." The other girl said, "Okay, but go slow, alright?" The previous driver got into the back seat with me and confined me there to the middle seat. I was getting upset and wanted her to stop, but I didn't know how to because everyone seemed okay with this idea. My panic got even worse when this sophomore girl started asking them how to even turn on the car and how to operate it. "You don't even know how to drive a car?" I asked in despair. "No, I don't. It's my first time trying. My parents haven't let me learn." I tried to stop her, but the car's owner told me I couldn't decide over her car and said it would be okay. There was no one out driving at this hour, and they would help her friend learn how to drive. I asked them to let me out of the car, but they would not let me. They swore it was a very short drive, and we would go slowly and it would be okay. The girl really had no idea about how to even start to drive. Unfortunately, this was an automatic transmission car. Had it been a manual one, she probably wouldn't even have been able to move it. And the car moved, but in the ways you would expect for a driver who had never stopped the pedals of an actual car. She would slam the brakes and steer the wheel too hard. She drove right in the center of the road and kept freaking out while others tried to tell her what to do. I was begging them to let me out of the car, but they would not listen to me. Fortunately, the streets were empty, but I couldn't help but fear that if any car came, we would surely crash right into it. After a harrowing journey, we made it to the street where the bus station was. As soon as they pointed that out, I asked them to stop the car already and let me walk there, but they did not. They forced me to be dropped off right in front of the station. Thankfully, in the end, no one got hurt, but I don't even know how I could get out of this sort of situation if I was ever in it again. So this happened to my friend and I almost 2 decades ago, but I'm only now realizing the severity of it, now that I remembered it. We were like 10, her, and 12, me. Both girls. We snuck out in the middle of the night on a sleepover because we had this dumb urge to get some cola. During that time, the only store that was working nights was a small liquor store a 30-minute walk away from where our house was. It was right next to a train station, which was a sketchy place overall full with drunks and the like. But us being so young, we didn't know that, so we just went right ahead. The walk to the place was fine, quiet, as midnights tend to be in a small town. Shortly after we started walking back though, we noticed this car go by. The only car at that time, so of course we took a note. At first we didn't think too much of it, but then we noticed it drive past us again, and a couple minutes later once more. We got to alert and started walking faster. We were walking on the main street, which was pretty well lit, so I assume now that the only reason nothing happened was because the person driving wanted to get us to a darker place. He took a turn towards a darker street once, trying to get ahead of us, but as we walked past it, he drove out of it and started following us once more. The moment we reached the street where we had to turn to our house, we took a sidewalk shortcut and we ran. The shortcut didn't allow the car to drive after us straight away. Instead, he had to drive slightly straight, then right again into our street. Luckily, this shortcut existed, because at that time the street had no light. Absolutely none. We noticed that the car, instead of continuing driving, did actually start turning onto our street. That's how we confirmed it was actually following us. Good thing the house was very close by the time he turned onto our street, so he couldn't drive to us fast enough to get us. My god though, when I think of it now I'm even more frightened than I was then, because I know what could have happened since I understand more. We could have been kidnapped or molested or even killed, who knows? At that time, my friend and I forgot about the situation the very next day, because we didn't realize what could have happened. I wish I was smart enough back then to have remembered the plate numbers or anything. I hope that person didn't hurt anyone in that town. I now feel lucky because nothing happened to us, and my hometown is now in a completely different light for me since the realization.